So joining us this afternoon for the keynote in our presentation here again is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers out of the Omaha District. They're led by Jen Gett, who's the project manager for this team. We've been working with her since I started, and I know most of this team or all this team has been working with MSAC for a number of years. So, Jen?
Thanks so much, Scott. So in 2019, we actually signed the agreement to get this project started and started with some scoping. So we're going to kind of pass the presentation around the room. So we've got Paul Boyd and in place of our economist, we've got Justin Brewer, the supervisor of the section that Jeff did the writing of the report, but Justin will be presenting for us today. And then Greg Johnson will also be talking kind of the bigger picture with our authorities. So,
Yeah, just click the mouse.
okay, enter is what we want to do. All right, so let's get this out of the way too. Is there a way to make that smaller? Okay. This study, like I said, we started in 2019, and we decided to conduct it in 3 phases. So initially that first phase was just scoping the rest of the project. It kind of gave us the ability to get some funding to kind of set out what we wanted to do with this project. So we got a detailed scope for our phase 2, and then we are now in phase 2. We're wrapping up that report now, and we just started the framework of phase 3. So shortly we'll be starting to scope that out and get a schedule and the actual goals to do. So phase 2 of our project was looking at all the sediment management studies we've got and look outside that box, apply some non-traditional economic analyses to those sediment solutions, and then look at some trend analysis, what impacts are going to be seen in the near future and distant future. And then in June 2021, we hosted a solutions workshop with a variety of sedimentation experts, and we'll talk detail of all these points. I've also got our cost share up here if you're curious. It is under section 22, a 50-50 cost share. And so you can see what MSAC and your partners have contributed, both working kind and cash. And then our phase 3, what the initial plan was to do is to expand these technical analyses of all these various sediment management technologies, and then look further into that, both through engineering, economics, and environmental analyses, and then actually put together some recommendations for a sedimentation management plan. And so we'll be developing that further, hopefully shortly. And then I'm going to turn it over to Paul to start talking parts of phase 2.
All right, thank you, Jen. I'll take that from you. Put that in here. Okay. All right, so you'll have to envision that this says prediction of future conditions under there. See that with me. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Most of you know me. I've been coming up here since I had a lot less gray hair and we had a lot less sediment, but here we are. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about today is, as Jen pointed out, we've got kind of 2 phases in this, 2 sections to this phase 2 study. When we went through and scoped this, there were a number of questions about what will work, what would be an effective management method and subsequent plan for Lewis and Clark Lake. But the obstacle has really always been the economic justification for it. We have plenty of technologies, we have plenty of methods that we use all over the world to manage sediment in, through, around, over, past reservoirs. So there's plenty of mature science and some emerging science we'll talk about here, but there's plenty of mature science that says we can't do this. But in the traditional process of justifying a project like this, it has to be that to pass that muster, we have to have more benefits from taking the action than the action costs. Right, so as part with knowing that, in scoping with MSAC for this phase 2, we really said, we need to ask the economic questions. There is no reason to do, very in-depth environment or engineering analysis on a method if we can't at least get close on the economics and say that we can justify a project. That's so it kind of flipped that around and said, we know we've got a set of general sediment management methods work. Let's do a dive on the economics, see what that shakes out, and that will drive us into phase 3 on maybe helping us decide which of these methods we should investigate further. So I am going to go through from kind of the engineering side, the future projections we did of sedimentation, and give you kind of an overview of the methods, the workshop that we did 2 years ago, the methods that were recommended out of that workshop and general framework for those in this section. And then we'll talk the economics there. So prediction of future conditions, a lot of words here to say that we all know that since closure in 1955, we've been catching sediment. We've been catching quite a bit of sediment. The number we use is about 2,600 acre feet a year, roughly 4 million cubic yards, if you want to work in smaller numbers there. That is the number that we monitor and track below the top of the flood control pool. Okay, and the top of the flood control pool is about 5 feet above what you normally see Lewis and Clark at. We regulate the lake at somewhere between 1204 and 1206 elevation normally. From 1208 to 1210, those top 2 feet are the top of the flood. They are the flood control pool, that 2 feet. And so that number we measure for sediment is just up to that top of that flood control pool. You all know there is additional sedimentation going on above that, because the top of that pool, is only up to right about just past the Springfield area. We're collecting sediment in the Missouri River Reach, all the way up to about Lazy River Acres and along the lower Niobrara River for that first 6 or 7 miles. That sedimentation is in addition to that number that is in those reports there. It's not as much as that, but it's not insignificant either. It's depending on what survey we look at, it could be up to another million yards a year type of number. So what we wanted to do for this analysis, this is to drive the economic analysis. We need to figure out make an estimate of when we start to impact some of these project benefits. Some of them are already impacted, right? Recreation, access, water supply, water quality issues. Some of those we already see every day out on the reservoir. But the big ones that drive this economic analysis are oftentimes, ability to regulate for navigation, hydropower, impacts to the ability to manage floods. And those are benefits that kind of decrease over time as we get the reservoir more and more full. So what we did is in our office is we went through and note here, this is based on the scope of what we're doing here. These are estimates made from doing a volumetric change, measuring, taking our old survey and our new survey and subtracting the difference, figuring out how much volume we're adding in sediment, and then looking at aerial imagery to track the face of the delta. We all know it used to be on the other side of Springfield, and now it's past Bantee, it's on its way to Devil's Nest, and we all know where that goes. But so this is a basic assessment here. You could do a finer assessment, but what it does is it gives us an estimated future condition every decade until we think we roughly lost all of the storage in the system, and then that feeds the economic analysis and says, like, when do we have concern for that Cedar Knox intake? When do we think the face or the front end of the delta gets close enough to the hydropower intakes that we would have a concern there, that we would start to consider the loss of hydropower in the system? And then when do we get to a point where it's completely full, and we would call it essentially complete loss of benefits at that point. Because in that future condition, while we don't have any sediment in that flood control pool, if we have a completely full reservoir, we don't have the ability to actively use those gates to manage anything. And if we can't close gates, we can't use the flood control pool. So this is these are the estimates for this. And so these there's a whole set of maps here, and I apologize, the text is really small here. But what you're seeing is essentially that, you know, by decade, this is kind of, you know, you all know you can see the delta at the surface, right? But if you've ever tried to drive a boat across the face of the delta, the lake's about that deep for quite a while there. And you have to go about 1.5 miles out from the face of that delta before you can get, you know, 2-3 feet deep of water. So just these are basic volumetric projections of when kind of you would see that face of that delta migrate through these different areas. And then this feeds into, you know, economics. Well, if the delta passes this point right here, what infrastructure do we have on the reservoir that is then affected at that time? And so these continue on here, moving down the reservoir, and then all the way down to you know, when we get to Gavin's Point Dam. It's a simplification, right? There's obviously going to be multiple braided channels moving through the reservoir at the time. But this analysis was done to feed the econ. I will, you know, caveat this, that, right, these are based on historical trends. If you can tell me exactly what Mother Nature is going to do for the next 150 years, we can refine this a little bit. But that's just to reinforce, there's a fair bit of uncertainty here, but in this level of study, they give us threshold locations to say, here's a way to track how we start to lose benefits over the next 100 and, depending on how you want to interpret that, is completely full, somewhere in the 125 to 150 year range for completely full. You'll see, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but we're looking out here at roughly this 2100 line, and with the slope of the delta underwater, and we know how far it extends now, this threshold of roughly 70 years in the future was determined to be the point which we would have significant concerns about the viability of hydropower, because we would expect that somewhere in that window, we may have the nose, or what's called the foreset of that delta, getting a fair bit close to the intakes for the hydropower system. And as anybody who's ever sandblasted paint off a car, sand and hydropower, not good bedfellows, right? That's a non-starter. System isn't built and designed to handle the Niobrara and the Missouri River sand. You know, that being said, and talking to water management, we had a discussion about if we need a major hydropower overhaul at Gavin's Point, at say 70 years or 50 years here, you know, we do major rehabs on our big reservoir projects. And as the water management chief, I said, if you had to pay for a major hydropower, major overhaul at Gavin's Point in 50 years, is it a foregone conclusion that you would do that? And his response was, well, no, I do not think so. Simply looking at the way renewables have changed over the last 20 years. We went from 0 to where we are today on wind and solar, and there's, you know, discussion of new nuclear facilities and all of that. So in his opinion, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that 50 years from now, you'd spend however many hundreds of millions to do a hydropower rehab. It may not make sense at that time. It may make sense at that time. These other things may not turn out to be what they think they are. And this is still a very viable, cheap, clean energy, renewable energy resource. But, you know, it's something that can be taken into consideration, but is not figured into this analysis. And then a reminder that deltas grow in both in all directions, right? Don't just grow this way down the lake. They create a backwater effect. And that backwater effect slows that sediment that's coming in down from above Fort Randall here. So, you know, the additional projections based on the slope up there that, you know, we saw at closure, you know, the deltas start to form at the mouth of the Niobrara, and that has continued to kind of work its way upriver. Some estimates there that it will continue to do that. And the very same thing on the Niobrara River, right? As we continue to have that backwater impact. Yeah. Same.
Is the impact felt in that whole area or?
Well, it's drawn bluff to bluff to imply that there can be impacts in that whole area. We do not have the granularity to say that, you know, there's an impact on this side, but not on this side. We drew them bluff to bluff to make sure that we understood that, you know, as in Niobrara, it wasn't a surface water issue, it was a groundwater issue, right? And so that's why those are drawn bluff to bluff. These are a lot narrower together than they are in the Missouri because the slope of the Niobrara River is a little steeper than the Missouri. So a little bit on the workshop and the alternatives that were recommended out of the workshop. As we said, for this one, there's a lot of focus on the econ side of this thing. So these are kind of conceptual, general discussion of different methodologies. And as you saw in the first slide, the outcome of this is taking the econ results mixed with or meshed with this general review of consideration of reasonable and practical alternatives and deciding which ones to do deep analysis on. You know, so there's on the management side, this is more of kind of a screening effort in this phase 2 here. So in June 2021, we engaged this list of reservoir sediment management national and international experts, and we brought them up here for a couple of days. Great support from MSAC and everyone here to put on some tours, get them out on the river and the reservoir, and provide them as much background information we could about the conditions, about the infrastructure, about the management, all of those things. And we asked them what management actions they would recommend with the system like it is, or are there modifications or changes in either the management or the system that they think should be considered going forward. So that was in June of 2021, and kind of going through all these different options, and these are all will be all laid out in the report, kind of section by section here. This one says workshop outcome traditional dredging. Okay, this is one thing the Corps of Engineers does a lot of dredging. We move a lot of material. We've got 200+ years of experience with it. It is a well-established technology. We can do it a bunch of different ways, but there's no mystery here. Okay, we can put multiple pieces of large equipment on the reservoir. We can pick up sediment, we can move it wherever we want, and we can put it down wherever we want. You know, the question is where to pick it up, where to move it, where to put it. You know, all those things go into it too. But as part of the first recommendation from this group, we shared a plan that the Corps developed, working with our office in New Orleans District. New Orleans District does very, very large dredging projects for coastal applications, keeping harbors open and tight. And so they are one of the few other places that deals with the volumes of sediment we're talking about on Lewis and Clark Lake. So they laid out with some of these, some of the additional feedback from this group, kind of 3 options that you could use for dredging. I do want to make clear, you know, this is purely from an engineering side. There are obviously social, environmental, economic, a wide variety of other issues that have to be considered here. I'm speaking to this just for in the context of moving sediment from point A to point B. Okay, so one of the recommendations was mechanical excavation with barges. And that's essentially like you see a large excavator, steam shovel type of equipment, and then filling barges and moving it down the lake, and then developing some sort of unloading system to get it in the river downstream. All of these options are generally looking at the Missouri River downstream as a receiving water. And many of us who talked with you before, that is done simply because of the volume of material we're talking about here. If you're that 2,600 acre feet per year, that reference number, if you take that, if you want to like wrap your head around that a little bit, take a football field, half a mile tall. So stand on your football field and it's taller than either of the Twin Towers, the Freedom Tower, any of those. So sometimes it is really hard to wrap your head around the gigantic volume. So if you're only going to spread it a foot deep out on the landscape, you've got to spread it over 2,500 football fields. Even if we spread it 10 feet deep, I've got 250 football fields, right? Okay. And as a point, that's every year, right? So because of that, and then the just sheer volume we're dealing with, these designs are set with the Missouri River as a receiving water. We completely understand that brings its own set of issues. The second option is a single dredge with boosters, traditional cutter head dredge, large system with a big, essentially cutter head vacuum that moves back and forth. And all of these plans were generally kind of identified to, harvest sediment from that face of the delta. The intent would be to, hold what we have, right? Keep what is still open lake. And that would take a single dredge and then have floating booster plants to keep it moving through a pipe and discharge. And the third is staged dredges, where instead of boosters, you go from dredge pile to dredge pile to dredge pile, and you move it down that way. So those are all traditional dredging methods that are used in other places that would work here. The second one here is that the crew at the workshop brought up was sluicing, or I sometimes call it flushing, sluicing or flushing with augmentation. Sluicing is a drawdown of the reservoir to a run-of-river condition to try and let the river transport sediment. Works best in short reservoirs with steep slopes, and it works best with low-level outlets, and it works best with fine sediments. All of which we don't have, right? This reservoir is not built to sluice or flush. It was never part of the design consideration. There are no low-level gates. It is what it is. The recommendation that the group made was to consider something called augmentation, which is helping out. We have not an ideal geometry. Can we make that geometry better? Can we somehow channelize the river to give it a more direct path to the outlets? Can we modify the dam in some way? Can we help the river erode more sediments in some way? We have example sluices where, albeit on smaller reservoirs, where when the system is drawn down, we literally have bulldozers pushing material into the running river to maximize the transport capacity of the river and minimize the time that the reservoir has to be drawn down. Okay, not ideal, but none of these management actions are ideal, right? It'd be better if we just didn't have to do this, but this one comes with its own set of obstacles too. We'll talk about a little, later studies we're talking about here. The Corps of Engineers just collected a new hydrographic survey of Lewis and Clark, from Gavin's Point Dam all the way up to Fort Randall. And so we'll be doing a new, area capacity analysis with that. So I know you've all been using the 27% gross storage loss number since 2011. By next year, we'll have a new number. And we all know that number is going to be bigger. I just don't know how much bigger, because that survey is going to capture what happened in 2011 and 2019 in the system there, both which were events that probably delivered significantly more than the annual average sediment delivery to the reservoir. And in parallel with that, we did develop a flushing model that looked at all these different scenarios back in 2015. We're updating that now. And these kind of look at some of those augmentation things, right? So we start with just looking and modeling what the delta is going to do for the next 64 years. That's not a random number. That's what we had for the period of record at the time, from 1955 to 2017 or whatever it was. So we used that, we repeated that. But then there's a number of alternatives where we look at putting low elevation tunnels. What if we were to do a major dam modification and get a project that put lower flushing or sluicing tunnels in the reservoir? What if we lowered some of the spillway gates? If we did a project there, could we make this more efficient? So that the results of those updates won't be available as we finish up this phase 2, but they will be there if we want to leverage them for a deeper dive in phase 3. So just, this is just a little example of what this model shows. Here's, showing that we simulated lowering the gates by 10 feet, half the gates there. And this profile plot is essentially, showing when we lower the gates, we scour a little bit less. These are river miles. So this is 827, right? This is right up by the Delta, just downstream of Springfield. And, this blue line is saying that with a regular flush, we'd move some material up at Springfield and we drop it all out before it ever got over the spillway. It'd fill in that hole right down by the dam. Whereas if you had low level gates, you can see this is going up as material deposited. So since this stays pretty much flat with that alternative, we're not dropping a lot of material down right by the dam. It's using those low level outlets. This is the type of, the dropped gates. This type of analysis we can do and that we'll have with that next one. Same thing with tunnels. You can see there's the 14 gates that everybody knows and loves on Gavin's. The 14 Tainer gates are right here in our model. And this is showing that we put five low-level tunnels underneath the gates so that they're right down at the bottom of the reservoir. And as you might guess, that makes a sluicing or flushing action much more efficient. And the goal of that would be to get to an action like this would hopefully get you to a sustainable reservoir sooner, speeding up the natural process. It's in 150 years, you've got a sustainable reservoir because in is going to equal out at that point. What we're trying to do is find a sustainable solution that still maintains an open lake. So that's stuff that'll all be available for phase 2 or for phase 3. We did an assessment through one of our programs that we were able to leverage at no cost to this study to identify sinks and sources within the Niobrara River. This is another thing that the team identified. We all know that the majority of material that's ending up in the Delta is coming out of the Niobrara. And the Niobrara coming through the sand hills and being spring fed and having hundreds of feet of sand to harvest is not going to change its MO anytime soon. However, in this assessment we did, and a lot of this, we went all the way, you know, all the way out, broke this up into all these reaches. There are some reaches out there that are pretty darn stable. They're not degrading, they're not ungrading, they're not providing sediment to the system. There are other reaches which you can just stand there and watch the banks cave in, right? And watch the river cut back and forth and pick up and move all that sugar sand down there. So we have a basic assessment of this in phase 2 and made some recommendations for following that up. There's a wide variety of opinions on that. Some people are, you know, that's where absolutely we should look. And there's other people that are like, it's so spread out and you'd have to do so much that it's not worth it. I think the truth lies somewhere probably in between. I think there's probably a couple opportunities of highly degrading, very focused reaches where with some smart engineering with nature, we might be able to reduce that load. The question would be, is reducing that load enough to matter? One, for total load, and 2, can you justify it economically? So that was another thing that the workshop group recommended that be followed up on. One other wild card in there and is the contribution from the Spencer Dam failure. Okay, that was a one-time event. But you had a significant amount of sediment deposited behind Spencer Dam and been flushed twice a year. So essentially managed as a equilibrium project for the past about 50, 60 years. Okay, flush it in the spring, flush it in the fall, it fills back up. So on a long-term annual basis, Spencer Dam wasn't catching any more sediment. It was passing what it had, but you had all the sediment that had been built up and collected in there before we went to that flushing or sluicing regime. So as part of this assessment here, we went and pulled a set of LiDARs, aerial terrain, to look at that. And you could, the drop there extends 20 miles up. 20 plus miles up the Niobrara, you had deposited sediments in there that have all been coming out. So if you look at that over 100-year sediment delivery plan, probably not significant, but in the short term, kind of this from 2019 into now, you have an acute, fairly significant contribution of all that material coming out that was behind Spencer Dam. One of the other ones they had, they did not make a recommendation to do anything about Spencer Dam because, well, it is what it is, right? It's no longer a part of our management equation. They did also recommend further investigation on harvesting bedload material as a source into the system. This is a couple of examples here. This is, I apologize if this picture, but imagine this laying on the bottom of the river, any river. It's graded on one side. It's got a couple of connections here to large pumps and settling system. And the system is designed to harvest some of that bed load, some of those coarser sand materials that are moving along the bottom of any river. The idea being if you can harvest and use some of those sediments for something else before they end up in the delta, they may be easier or more cost effective or more practical to harvest. So this is one thing, and I don't know, Sandy, if you were going to talk about it later on, but this is the setup that the Corps Research Lab has that we've kind of been talking about running a pilot on the Niobrara River next year. So that was another recommendation by the group. And then I'm going to go through a couple others here that were not part of that, but are things that have been in kind of our consciousness for the last decade here. Dr. Roland Hotchkiss is on the phone with us, and he and Dr. Howard Coker, going on a decade ago now, wrote a paper about the idea. And it's affectionately called the Coker Plan. But essentially what it is they had conceptualized an idea where we kind of set off the sediments that had already deposited, leave them where they are, prioritize river flow around them. And this is very similar to what we're talking with augmentation, right? We've already got that deposit there. Can we create a system where we can increase efficiency of the river to get sediments towards the dam. And then they proposed an R&D effort to create some autonomous tools, equipment, that could drastically reduce some of the operating costs to manage and continue some of that moving. So that is another thing that, and we're going to talk about autonomy here in just a minute. This was probably a little ahead of its time 10 years ago, but you'll see in here in just a minute, we've got manufacturers who are saying, well, we've got autonomous dredges now that just go out, like fire up the Roomba, right? Let's just put the Roomba on the river and there we go, right? And we laugh, but let's look at let's see, we got the Roomba right here. Okay, so one other thing that happened in parallel with all of this is the Bureau of Reclamation hosted a national prize competition. The federal government has set up a bunch of these under the America Competes Act. And the concept is that we in the federal government, while we like to think we know everything, guess what? We don't. And there are really smart people out there who don't work in our circles that might have really good ideas. We call them solvers, right? Citizen solvers. So I've been working on this project for 20 years, and sometimes we all think we're way too close to it. And it's hard for me sometimes to think outside of the box on something that would, I have all the constraints already in my head. Well, citizen solvers do not have those constraints in their head. They don't think, well, you can't do it because of this, that, or the other thing. So they put out, and we partnered with Reclamation on this, called it the Guardians of the Galaxy. I guess it was a very weak attempt at a joke on Guardians of the Galaxy, Guardians of the Reservoir, whatever. But 50 plus ideas submitted, some very conceptual, and the challenge was build a better mousetrap for getting sediment out of the reservoir. That was the challenge, okay? And we went through 3 award phases. There was real money. I think the total prize money was upwards of $600,000 across multiple phases. And it was to encourage these citizen solvers, whether they be just working conceptually on a napkin, or whether they had an actual business plan, or whether they were welding something together in their garage to move technology forward to help with this problem. So over the course of 2 years, we got down to 3 finalists, and they put together these proposals, and 2 of these, the first one is a sediment compression piston pump. That being said, essentially a technology to pull and highly compress sediment into logs so that you get an extremely high density, and then just like an oil pipeline, everybody heard of like a pig in an oil pipeline, right? It's essentially a bullet that goes down a pipeline. It runs on a really thin laminar layer of fluid between it and the pipeline, therefore consuming very little of that liquid in the system. And their concept was take your sediment, compress it into these logs, and then send it down a pipeline because it doesn't use very much water and it's much, much denser. The mass of sediment moved per unit volume is a lot higher than what you get out of a dredge. The second one was a 3D dredger. That's that picture in the center. And they proposed a system which had replaceable heads on the bottom of it. One of them essentially a grapple to pull up large woody debris. One of them more of a suction head dredge. And another one that would go through and disturb the material, kind of fluff it up if you happen to have a current that could help you do it to move sediment. And the third one right down here was called desediment. And it is a technology that's in demo phase on a number of reservoirs in Europe. And their system is fully autonomous, run off of satellites. There's nobody on that. I mean, you could put people on it to check it, but the idea is that you can run a much smaller system because it runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 and 4.25 days a year. And so with that type of system utilization, you can very much downsize. Instead of maybe using a big dredge with a 24-inch pipe, we're using a dredge that's running all the time with a 12-inch, 8 or a 12-inch pipe, something like that. And the hope is you're reducing the impact footprint on the reservoir. You know, all of these do have, like traditional dredging, they have a presence, right? You have equipment out on the reservoir, you have public safety concerns, you have water quality concerns, you have all those things. But so those are three technologies that are kind of emerging, that could be under consideration for a deeper dive with phase 3. All three of these companies are very, very excited to find some sort of collaboration to put a pilot on a reservoir to get this done. You know, realistically, you know, Lewis and Clark is a big nut to crack for a pilot to get sediment all the way down there. But I think there are some significant savings, and kind of reference those savings. So we put out last fall to Colorado School of Mines Engineering University in Golden, Colorado, essentially a suburb of Denver. We put this idea of putting one of these technologies on Lewis and Clark Lake out as a idea for a capstone engineering project. And I wrote the thing up and like, nobody's gonna take it. Are you kidding me? Nobody, everybody's like, reservoir sedimentation. These folks are like, that sounds cool, let's do it. Okay, so we're doing it. And so what they did is they worked with those three companies from the last slide there, those three finalists there, and they did some plan analysis, some pump rate analysis, some cost analysis, to see what, you know, a kind of proposed system on Lewis and Clark would look like. We gave them a little bit of pass and said you only had to move 1 million cubic yards a year, which is still a fantastically huge amount of sediment, right? But it's about 25% of our annual load in the lake, okay? So what they did is they looked at those other three and they came up with a recommendation of putting one of these de-sediment units at the delta, essentially just let it Roomba back and forth across the delta there, and then have a couple of discharge booster pumps to move sediment downstream. And now I do want to, Justin's cringing in the back, our economist going, these numbers are made up by a bunch of college students, and yes, they are. And so I'm going to reinforce this. These are not our numbers, and they are not reviewed. They do not follow our standards, but they matter, right? They still matter on this. They did a basic assessment. They talked to the manufacturers about what a piece of equipment costs. They got some labor rates, you know, they got some equipment rates. They did some escalation, determined some O&M numbers and all of that. Because they wanted to see, because one of our challenges, like, well, we're pretty sure we can do this with a dredge for $15 a yard. Okay, $15 a yard times 4 million yards, do the math every year, right? That's a big number. Is there something cheaper than that? Is there any way you could reduce that cost? Well, they came up with a rough number. If they did 1 million yards a year and they did replace the pipe at year 4 and year 8, and they could keep their O&M to about 2 million a year, they could move 20 million yards, or excuse me, 10 million yards over the next decade at $5 a yard. I don't know if that number's right. It's $1 more, $5, you know, $5 more, $2 less. At this point, I'm not sure it really matters, but it is noticeably less than our current estimate for a traditional dredging system, which in my thought kind of warrants more investigation. So yeah, they did a pilot. They kind of laid it out in a plan here, and we sent, Sandy can forward, there's a nice big poster that they put on that, and I hear they got an A-. Not too happy about that, shooting for an A, but I was told by their advisor it's because of their report format, not because of their engineering concept. So that makes us feel better. Okay, so that's all right. You've seen some of my report formats. I'm not even A-. So a quick thing on economic opportunities, right? There's a much more detailed discussion of this and as we go through the report. But the problem is right now, we got lots of sand. Nobody needs this much sand, right? What do we do with it? Well, number one, obviously the most logical point would be to put it in the river. If we can't do that, or we can't fully do that, and we need to augment it somehow, what are other opportunities? We talked about as part of this pilot, if we get a big pile of sand, can we have Knox County and state of Nebraska want to use it on the roads next winter? Okay, these are all small pieces, but we're going to have to build small pieces into something bigger if we're looking for alternative or economic uses out of this. Construction aggregate, recreation. We still got the John Remus plan. Many of you know him, the chief of water control. He's always suggested we get a helicopter and get $10 million of gold nuggets. Well, inflation, $20 million of gold nuggets. It's going to go out with a helicopter. It's going to drop them all over the building, right? And it's a free for all. Anybody can come and do their thing, but the rule is for every bucket of sand you look for gold in, you got to take the sand with you. All the gold you want, harvest whatever you want, but you got to take the sand with you, or the world's largest beach volleyball tournament. Either of those. And I don't say that to make light of it, but to reinforce it is a really big problem, and not just one of these things is going to be part of the solution. Ash Grove Cement, talking with one of our collaborators at our ERDIC Research Lab. Ash Grove Cement has a big plant in Louisville, and they have another plant in Omaha as part of one of these bed load collector pilots, and talking about kind of this circular economy concept. They're talking about using some of this harvested bed load material from Minnesota and trucking it down to Omaha to use. And I was like, I have closer sentiment. I save you some money. Yeah, we got this little lake right up here. You can have all you want from it. And if we can get a pilot in, I got nice, clean, sorted piles of it right there, right off of Highway 12, and you can truck it. So those are the type of opportunities we need to continue to examine, in addition to the grosser application of putting it in the river or other locations. So I'll take a real quick pause here and a break. Talking to Sandy, kind of do this section by section with questions. Before we switch topics, any questions from y'all for me on what this content was?
Rollin online.
Yeah.
Rollin. Maybe had to leave.
Did you put something in the chat or?
Yeah, he just, in the chat, he did say that, he would recommend a pilot test with de-sediment.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. We'll talk about funding opportunities here in a little bit. We'd love to put, de-sediment out there. It's not a cheap proposition, but we're looking at opportunities. Yeah.
Hey, Paul, and some of the models put forth with the lower elevation.
Yes. Yes.
Does that still involve basically completely draining the reservoir? You get that sand flow, or are you looking at an underwater flow of sand somehow down through a flow gate?
So yeah, normally an underwater flow is associated with a turbidity current, which is where you have very, very fine material that almost kind of moves as a mud flow at the bottom. We don't have enough of that since we're mostly sand. We don't have enough of that to really build a management system around a turbidity current. We really wouldn't move that much. So yes, in that sense, those modifications, whether it be dropping at gates or new flushing tunnels, it would still necessitate draining the lake. So that's not ideal, but what that technology does is, like, without those, you have really no hope of that sluicing process working or being efficient for another 50, 60, 70 years as you move the sediment closer and closer. Because if I sluice it today, I move a little sand from Springfield and I deposit it in the bottom of the lake. And I really haven't gotten anywhere. And I've incurred all of those you know, all of that collateral damage that is going to happen with that event. The advantage there is that if you do that sort of modification, you can start to have a real tangible benefit on the very first time you do it. But you still, yeah, in this process, you still have to do that.
And 2011 showed the different types of settlement moving through, and the lighter stuff, the core stuff, is stayed up there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's, you know, the fine stuff has never, you know, the fines, there is kind of a layer of pudding up past the delta, right? But that makes up a very small percentage. And it's honestly, it's easier to manage, but it's not the part of it that gives us the benefits we're looking for, maintaining the lake, maintaining all the project purposes and that kind of thing. So we've been focusing primarily on that roughly 70% of this total load that's sand. That's, if we're going to make a difference, it's in the sand, right? So, all right, yeah.
On your last slide there,
Yeah.
you went past the fracking or. fracking.
Yes, yeah.
Is that just because of the volumetric wouldn't be significant enough or?
Well, I apologize for skipping over there. The reference was there, the US Geological Survey a couple of years ago did an assessment of the sediments on the Niobrara River for that application, right? Because they have to create these sand slurries to pump down in you know, the fields in North Dakota or Pennsylvania, or wherever they are. That assessment said that there is a fraction of that material, which is suitable kind of at a mid-level with some treatment. So it's not the perfect material right now. It is a usable material. The current obstacle to that is, unfortunately, there's a lot of the equivalent material much closer to Williston, North Dakota than Yankton, South Dakota. If we had you know, if we had fracking at Lake Andes, it'd be a whole different ballgame type of thing. But those, you know, that is just to point out that those opportunities there, we need to keep looking for them. So, okay, Jen, I'll pass. Justin, are you gonna take it over from here?
I just wanted to know, we have shared the slides, so for folks who are interested in the images and the maps we're sharing, those are available. I don't know if Sandy, are you distributing them after the meeting? Just so you'll have access to those.
Yep, click it there and toss that in your pocket. Yeah.
No, I'm trying to get rid of that because it's blocking your screen.
I don't know.
Yeah, usually
It
it's
sucks right up in the top of the screen.
a little different than ours, so. Don't leave. No. I thought I'd take a minute to try. I think I'm not gonna get anywhere. All right.
We're gonna go like left and right to get
It looks like
back and
that's
forward and here and there.
familiar. You're good.
Cool. I might hang out over here most of the time, just, not quite a stage walker the way Paul is. But,
Put that on my name tag now.
yeah. All right. No, I liked it. I felt like you were up there. I mean, you had that like TED Talk style, you know, you're kind of.
At least you didn't call me a snake oil salesman.
There you go.
One step too far.
So just to introduce myself again, Justin Brewer, been with Corps of Engineers for about 12 years. Recently, became that, chief of the economic section, as I mentioned in my introduction. Unlike Paul, first time up here. First trip to Yankton ever. Similar to Paul, I do actually have a few grays starting to come in. They're hidden decently well for now. My wife does like to point them out at every opportunity to let me know that they're coming in.
Can you talk louder?
Oh, do I need, okay, I can project more. Okay, you let me know, Jim. So yeah, here today to talk about kind of the economic analysis that's been done to date, what we attempted to do during that phase 2. Just go ahead and get right into it. So kind of as Paul mentioned, a big part of this was doing this economic analysis, taking data that's out there, some existing data, and kind of trying to project or forecast into the future. But with a lot of our studies, ecosystem restoration studies, flood risk management studies, and kind of what we did here is also to kind of try to go through the history as much as we can. How did we get here? Some of that stuff is a little bit more concrete than what we're trying to project into the future. And I believe we were kind of asked to look at this as well, is we wanted to look at some historical costs incurred to date from sedimentation at Lewis and Clark. So what we did was we kind of came up with somewhat of an inventory of different things, stuff we could find in news articles, stuff that we got from various local officials, interested parties, stakeholders. We in our report, which is significantly more detailed than what we're presenting here today, we do kind of run through this list. Many of those things we couldn't find maybe readily available data or costs with some of those, but we did want to outline just to kind of give a bit of a scope of the impacts. We list, I mean, there's a lot of impacts to all kinds of infrastructure, roads, water supply intakes. And so the three that we kind of focused on here, some of the bigger ones, the stuff that was maybe just a little bit more at the front of people's mind right now. Obviously the Highway 12 project. I think I read that, the projected cost of that is anywhere from, kind of depending on what they were going to do from the EIS, in the, $150 million range up to $350 million, is a very real cost that's resulted from the sedimentation and the impacts that has had on the highway. I'm going to have to make a note or caveat on this movement of the town of Niobrara. I know that we have some Niobrara folks in the room. This was a somewhat late addition to the slide. We do have kind of a historical cost from the 1970s when this occurred. And when we were getting what we were trying to do is, update our numbers, make sure they're kind of at current, what we call like our current price levels in today's dollars. And there was a bit of a transpose error getting that number. 12 million is not right. It's probably not even particularly close. I think if you take the 1970s cost, you're talking many more tens of millions of dollars than that. So I did feel the need to point that out. Sorry for the error. And then also we have the movement of Springfield's water intake facility, which you had mentioned kind of at the top of the meeting. But just overall, over the years, hundreds of millions of dollars in impacts that have been realized. So with the study, with the Section 22 study, we are given a little bit more flexibility, a little more leeway in kind of how we conduct our analysis, given that it is not it doesn't result in a traditional decision document like a lot of our feasibility studies. A lot of the way we conduct our economic analysis is very policy-based, what kind of discount rates we use, the period of analysis that we're analyzing things over. And because of, again, many of the things that Paul outlined, the fact that the impacts, we're looking at something way beyond our traditional 50-year period of analysis. We do even have some policy that allows us to look at certain types of projects on a 100-year period of analysis. But again, this one goes even beyond that. And so what we did was we did kind of take this out to this 150-year period of analysis, something that somewhat coincided with when basically, the reservoir filled up with sediment, and we lose a vast majority of the benefits that are produced from that. So like I said, allows us to look at the big picture, and besides the 150-year period kind of coinciding with the sedimentation issue, there is some research to kind of back this up. Our economists who kind of undertook the analysis, did go out there and find some folks that are looking at these longer periods specifically for, large reservoir projects. So a big focus during this phase of the study, and kind of what we're presenting here today, in order to kind of do an analysis and look at the potential feasibility of different types of projects, is that we really need to try to establish a good baseline, what we often refer to as our future without project condition. But we just want to look at kind of an array of the different types of benefits that the reservoirs provide, how those are impacted over the period of time, other costs that are incurred. But we just want to kind of get, again, that baseline. If we don't do anything, what does it look like in 150 years? And what does it look like? We kind of annualize that over the period, so that we can kind of compare everything apples to apples when we look at the different alternatives. As we note here, kind of at some point, hydropower is going to be impacted. That sediment is going to fill up enough that the hydropower facilities, that different infrastructure, we're not going to be able to operate it, or we're going to have to make some kind of change. There is a point, and this is kind of accounted for in the economic analysis, in which there's potentially a loss of hydropower, a major impact to hydropower. Keep going there. As I work through these slides, we're just going to kind of go through the different kind of categories of benefits or impacts that we looked at. And I think people are familiar with the recreation, hydropower, water supply, and a few others that we'll cover here. But starting here with recreation, we attempted to use kind of the best existing data information that we had available to us. And for recreation, that came in the form of the MRRMP, Missouri River Recovery Management Plan, EIS. That document, that study took a kind of a comprehensive look at a lot of these different benefit categories. So with recreation, we have a few different ways in our policy that allow us to look at recreation benefits at core projects. This particular one, we were using a method we call unit day value. We're essentially assigning a value to a recreation visit based on some somewhat subjective and some objective criteria, kind of on the quality of the recreation. And then we essentially, we're taking visitation data that again, we're taking from the same study that the Corps collects. And we're more or less saying, annually we have this many visitors for these different types of recreation, times a particular value per visit. And that is what we end up coming up with for a kind of a total recreation benefit. So a couple notes on the slide. Again, as kind of jumping down to the third bullet here. So based on that method we're using, we're coming up with an annual, benefit of this $8.6, $8.7 million. I think a clarification that's necessary there is that is only counting, again, those visits and the value per visit. That is what kind of in our policy and guidance we're covering. as those, what we call the national economic development benefits, the types of benefits that we can directly compare to the costs to look at project justification. It's not accounting for things like, you know, increased regional or local economic activity from tourism, from people dining at restaurants, going to bars, extra tax revenue, increased jobs, et cetera. Those numbers, while they are quantifiable, and I believe we did take a shot at them within this analysis, they are typically not compared directly to cost of a project. So this plot we're looking at here is it's simplified, it's very linear, as you can see, looking at how recreation will decrease over time as that pool fills up, as the sediment fills in. I think kind of something to note here, or the distinction that was made was that we have kind of the water-based recreation, which the assumption there is that once that reservoir is filled in, there's not going to be much, if any, water-based recreation at that point in the future. Whereas some of the recreation around the lake may not be as water-specific or water-based. And so there's still a very significant decrease in visitations by the year 2050, but we don't take that quite to zero. And that would account for the additional, or the $1 million in recreation benefits that we're estimating would still be provided. Another category of things that we looked at, so these agricultural buyouts. I think based on kind of history that we know and what we would kind of project is that as the sediment fills in, and if the Corps were to take any action, then there would be a loss of more land, specifically some agricultural cropland. My economist wanted me to make sure to note that this is not representing any planned federal action. It's just kind of how we would project, if no action is taken, that buyouts of land would quite feasibly happen in the future. We utilize kind of this crop data layer to identify croplands in the area, some state resources to come up with kind of this value per acre. I know value per acre can vary a lot between states, counties, different types of crops. We got this average from the South Dakota State Landowners website, and I think that number even might be outdated by a year or two, and we ended up updating it to more current price levels, current dollar values. You can see we're estimating here that based on the number of acres over time, it would need to be bought out times the value of acre. We came up with this kind of lost benefit, or this cost of the sedimentation of the $26 million. Real estate we didn't have kind of real estate too involved in this. These aren't really representing a lot of those additional costs you might see like in a true real estate purchase. It's just kind of taking that value of land and saying if it's bought out and no longer in production. Another thing that's not accounting for at this time is lost agricultural production of those acres. Structure buyouts. Similar to the agricultural analysis, we're looking at kind of the area that is going to be impacted by the sedimentation, additional lands that are going to be impacted, and if there are structures on those, would they potentially have to be bought out, moved, replaced somehow? There wasn't a very in-depth real estate analysis of this. This was using a somewhat generic structure database that we kind of used to get some points done on a map. We kind of compare those structures looking at aerial imagery, compare that to how the sedimentation progresses, and just kind of come up with this count of structures that over the period would appear to be impacted by the sediment and would have to be bought, relocated, et cetera. Quick diagram just for example on kind of how we were, probably shouldn't be playing with that. On how we undertook the analysis, specifically with hydropower. Paul covered this some, but it's just this idea that as these sediment deposits, this dark brown kind of build up, eventually they're going to hit an elevation where they are going to affect the powerhouse and the hydropower infrastructure, the power generating infrastructure. And at that point, we're going to potentially start losing hydropower or have to find alternative ways to replace that. Best estimate here, and again, we kind of caveated that we're, best estimate, roughly 70 years or so, so about 2090 is when that sediment would get to a level where that powerhouse would not be able to generate any power. Because if we did try to, it would cause damage, et cetera. And then we came up with the value here of this $19 or $20 million annually in lost hydropower benefits. Again, in more detail in our report, but using some kind of simplified parameters there, looking at what is the annual power generation, coming up with an annual cost or value per unit of power generation. Kind of a sort of an extra little step we took with the hydropower that we thought was worth kind of some discussion in the report was that, yes, once those facilities kind of weren't operating, something would still probably need to be done. There would still be a cost to ensure that, you know, there aren't dam safety issues or other damages. And ultimately what would happen is this powerhouse would need to be decommissioned. And again, using kind of, it's not necessarily something that we have a whole lot of experience of in Omaha District, but we do have, there's some efforts out on the Columbia River. They're kind of undertaking this EIS and using some estimated costs for their decommissioning. We applied that here as kind of a cost if nothing was done and hydropower was lost. Water supply. Again, there's mention of water supply intakes being affected, multiple, both on South Dakota and Nebraska side of the reservoir. What we did here was we just wanted to look at, so if those water intakes are impacted, if the sedimentation is building up, you know, what is the most likely alternative, what's going to have to happen? It's very likely that some of these entities, assuming it's feasible, would have to extend their water intakes. And what we try to do is estimate and account for the cost of extending those water intakes. So if that sedimentation continues and there is no action, then there's going to be a cost to these various rural water districts, different communities to extend those water intakes. The cost, took the unit cost, kind of a per mile cost from some other water intake projects that we have within the districts. Just kind of using that as our best available data to estimate. Irrigation. More or less what we're looking at with irrigation is if folks lost their ability to irrigate with infrastructure that utilizes a reservoir, we kind of have to come up with a hypothetical. What is the least cost? What is the alternative? What costs are people going to incur to come up with a different way to irrigate their land? Our assumption here on kind of the engineering side and reality, personally, I'm a little less sure, but what we're looking at is if they lost that ability, that one alternative would be folks would have to dig wells. And so we kind of worked with some existing information we had and kind of reached out to some folks to figure out, well, what is the cost to dig these wells? How many wells would have to be dug to compensate for the lost irrigation from the reservoir? And based on the number of acres, which I believe was 5,000 or 6,000 acres, if I'm remembering correctly, came up with this cost of the roughly $700,000. This is a super cool looking plot. Our economist put together, absolutely loves it. I think it's a lot. Kind of back to the point of with this particular study, we had some flexibility in our methodology, the way that we looked at the analysis, some of our assumptions that don't necessarily follow along with our traditional policy. So he kind of looked into some of this research on different discounting methods. We kind of have a source cited down here. But just looking at, hey, if we kind of vary the way that the discounting were done, we did kind of a sensitivity analysis. So we looked at 9 different ways, kind of our traditional way of discounting, and then some others based on the research, just to see how does that impact kind of the results, the numbers over the period of analysis. And those results, I think we show here. Excuse me. So based on the analysis that we did, covering recreation, irrigation, water supply, hydropower, et cetera, came up with this estimate of over $2 billion in damages total over the period. If we were to just take a straight kind of average or annualization of that, that results in something that pretty big looking, the 13 to 14 million. But generally what we are doing or what we need to do in our analysis is we need to do the discounting and make sure we're really accounting for kind of the time aspect of these impacts, costs, expenditures. So you can see here in this annualized, it maybe would have been better if we organized them, biggest to smallest or something, but they're kind of, there's a good amount of variability, sensitivity to those different types of discounting methods. The particular one that we traditionally work with in our analysis and are expected to work with is this exponential discounting method here, resulting in the 1.8 million annualized. I think that's all I had. I imagine.
What was the unit day value that you would come up with?
Reading back to the report, I think we were somewhere around $8 or $9 a visit. And what they did was, because those unit day values do vary with the recreation type, whether it's kind of a specialized recreation, which is typically harder to substitute for, so it's considered higher value versus like a general recreation. And that particular study that we pulled that value from was looking at kind of an average over the different types of recreation.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Pat County, James River Water Development District. From the perspective of wintering in Yuma, Arizona, next to California, and knowing the loss of some of the farmland because of water, and the fact that we're losing thousands of acres of farmland each year around the nation to roads, housing, buildings, and so forth. And if we lose more than sedimentation, you're looking at 50 and 100 years down the road. You better also start looking at 50 and 100 years down the road. If we can't raise enough food to feed our people and have to get food from another nation, then we're going to be under some other nation's thumb.
This is Roland Hotchkiss. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah,
We can hear you.
Great. Thank you for that analysis. I've actually been waiting for some of those numbers for some time. And I'll be able to use those in an independent economic analysis. But what about downstream damages? Why weren't they included in your analysis at all?
That is a good question.
I mean, Roland, this was a real, this is Paul, a real brief summary here, and I know, Jeff, our economist, couldn't be with us today. I know that he did look into like the cost of the Section 32, Section 33 maintenance program, and some of the other degradation mitigation costs that were associated with the downstream. So I'll make a note of that, but I'm pretty confident there is a section in the report on those costs.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, we can definitely get back to you.
Yeah.
That
And Roland will see, Roland's supported with MSAC, so he'll see the draft report here very shortly.
for
So
sure. Yeah.
make sure you comment on that, Roland, if we've missed something there, please.
Oh, you bet I will.
Paul Luppa, still on the MSAC board. I'm also on the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee. So I'm very familiar with the management plan and the EIS on the recovery on the river. I made the comments in our, I work for the Isaac Walton League, and then our comments on the EIS. I guess protested that low figure for recreation of $8 a visit. When I go fishing, I spend that much on M&Ms. That doesn't count tackle, that doesn't count gas, that doesn't count maintenance on my boat motor and trailer. All those factors, if that isn't factored into this, that factor for recreation is so abysmally low that it doesn't even come close to projecting what recreation's value to this area is. So I would say that has to be reconstructed or refigured, or we're kidding ourselves with those numbers.
My best way to address that at the moment is being part of that implementation committee and kind of getting into that discussion of how the core values recreation, you may be aware. So we do have a few different methods. Unit day value is one of them. It is traditionally our most straightforward and preferred way of doing it. Those values are basically set out in policy for us each year. This is the value per visit. There are other methods for looking at the recreation that may come up with different values. I can't say for sure. They are also typically exceedingly resource intensive, time, money, etc. That for particular studies would probably be a bit of a burden. Which is why, again, we typically stick with the unit day value. And I agree, that number is attempting to capture a very specific part of the value of recreation. As I mentioned, there are a number of other expenditures people make, other money that flows in to the region and the local community that isn't necessarily accounted for in that number.
What it does go into that number?
What does go into that
You
number?
said they use.
The specific unit day, that number that is not capturing everything, what makes that $8 per visit? Do we know what the?
Can't even tell.
Could you ask me again? You're confusing me.
Well, it's up to $9 a
Yeah,
day.
you said certain things go into getting that figure, what goes into it, because you
Right.
can't get out of a convenience store for $9
Well,
anymore.
Mostly it's coming out of kind of could best explain somewhat of a maybe theoretical economic analysis that is kind of saying this is the value, this is what people are willing to pay for access or to experience whatever that recreation is. Again, it is that particular method or analysis would have been completed years ago, decades ago. And what we are kind of furnished with each year is policy and guidance it kind of dictates that for a particular visit, this is the value you must use if you're going to monetize your recreation and use it as a, or use it for project justification.
Is it adjusted for inflation? It sounds like a 1950.
Yeah.
It is adjusted for inflation.
I can tell you that number is not even close.
No,
It's not even in the ballpark.
$8 will be the day pass into one of the parks, one of the recreation
Which
areas.
is kind of what, you know, as Justin said here, it's like, what are people willing to pay to recreate? So I was just saying, it's great, it's like, the way the models, yeah, it's like, what would you be willing to pay for a day pass for a Nebraska State Park to go in and fish?
But that's
So-
not economic.
That is
impact.
not reflect, but it really is.
That just gets you access to the site. That doesn't count bait, tackle, equipment. It's so low that your numbers will be totally skewed if you don't adjust that number.
And I don't know how much, you know, the recreation actually would account.
Well, I was about to say,
Some of
so the trick here is, right, what could be done rudimentary is essentially a sensitivity analysis. You're talking about such big costs for any sediment management. If you triple, quadruple, sextuple that day cost, does it flip the analysis? I mean, if you said it was $50 a day instead of per visit, I'm sorry, $50 per visit instead of $8 per visit. Is there enough recreation to turn that, you know, does that turn, what was it, 8 million a year into 40 to 50 million a year? Something like that. Yeah, I think part of it is our limited. Yeah, we're trying to dance around this very rigid process that we're supposed to follow. And that's one of the limitations on it is we don't have, like, I don't disagree that, yeah, M&Ms cost $8, I'm with you. They were $7 yesterday, it'll be $9 tomorrow, I get it. But in a limited level of effort in this study, we don't have a model to capture that. That doesn't mean we couldn't look into that in the future and do more on that. Drew.
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, like, we're using that general recreation value, people use Lewis and Clark for different reasons. But there are the kind of specialized values within that, you know, memorandum of policy that we could look into doing a sensitivity analysis, and I'm not sure what's all included in Jeff's analysis, but, you know, just looking at that, like, specialized, fishing and hunting is like $27, you know, and within here, so if we looked into varying into that and or weighting that and doing sensitivity analysis, like, I think we could relatively easily capture that in the report, so I was just gonna add that nugget.
Yeah, I think that's something we could look at there. And one of the recommendations that we could put in there is that, you know, or identify in there that, you know, the method we're using is hamstrung by these things that aren't fully captured there. And then that is maybe a follow-on discussion to what level of effort you want to, because that would, I mean, if we're going to try and capture all of it, that's building, you know, an economic, you know, construct that we don't currently have. Yeah.
And maybe neither here nor there. But that dollar figure you're looking at affects the credibility of your report in a lot of people's eyes. And there are, you know, AFS can give you information on the value of a fishing trip. And there are sources out there that will give you the figures you're looking at. But just in my mind, in my line of work, looking at the report and you're claiming $8 a day, you know, for a recreational visit. I'm not gonna believe your report.
And it is.
That, Paul, I'm, you know, yeah, being somewhat critical, but
No, that's fine.
that's not even
Just no
close.
problem with that. No, that's.
And
And again, in the big picture of things.
Yeah, objects
Like I
matter.
say, you can take that 10, 20 times that, and it may not make a difference in your analysis. But it's the face value and the credibility of it, it's all.
And then one follow-up for me, and I'll be quiet. What's that based on number of visits on Lewis and Clark annually? What was your visitor count for that?
Oh. open the report and I'll get you a number today.
Cause
on
it's
what we
over
had.
2 million visits a year. If you're not over 2 million a year, again, those numbers won't stand the light of day.
Okay. And I think like they pointed out, between checking into the visits and varying that and looking at some of the other values that we kind of have available to us, these aren't particularly burdensome things to undertake, to come up with a range, to get those numbers calculated. It wouldn't be a big effort, and it wouldn't be difficult to include that, to kind of give people a fuller picture.
We're just gonna add, like, there is the recreational values, and we've had a lot of discussion, like, we'll look into some different sources and sensitivity analysis, and then there are also discussions, buying the bait and tackle, buying the M&Ms, like, those that go directly into the regional economy, which we do have an account, that's kind of a regional economic development account that we try and capture all that, because, like, those are costs, or, those are benefits to the region, the money that's getting pumped into the local economy. So we definitely want to try and capture that too. So there might be two different places, so trying to highlight that to tell the complete story.
The other thing we're considering, and I know this group has talked about this before, and it didn't make it onto a slide here. We've been struggling with, Justin noted this decommissioning cost, right? And everybody probably thought that number is really small, right? That number was really kind of only to mothball the powerhouse. That's not a dam removal or mitigation cost. We have been struggling with what number to put on that, and when you put a number on that, what is, if 100 years in the future, or when hydropower is no longer viable, is a decision made to decommission and then remove some of the infrastructure, all of the infrastructure? What does that look like? I can see a future scenario where that costs $100 million, $500 million, or $1 billion, right? There is no case study as big as Lewis and Clark to just look up in the literature. We've been trying to kind of scale that from some of the Pacific Northwest US dam removals, which have been in the, approaching, if not exceeding $100 million. What we had talked with Jeff about doing is just kind of a little bit like we're on this recreation, is doing a threshold. Like if you put, $100 million cost in 70 years, how does that change that kind of annual number? If you put 500 million, how does it change that annual number? So I know that was something that we had talked about, that will be, and it just honestly, it has to be pure speculation, right? But we're going to put in a range of numbers and say, okay, so realistically, it has to cost this much, or we have to expect this kind of expense in 100 years to continue to have a discussion about managing it now. And if it's not this much, then we have a very hard time, making it work. So just wanted to clarify the point on that one.
There's another thing that hasn't been brought up, is that once you do decommission all this, what about the flood damage? I know what kind of dollars they were looking at with 2011. What's that gonna be if this is decommissioned, and at the same time during that period, like Frank's case is gonna be filling in?
Yeah. So, as it is right now, one of the obstacles we've had is the way the system is managed, that flood storage lost at Lewis and Clark Lake is actively reallocated to Francis case. So making that case doesn't fit in our model. In 100 years, with Randall, with Francis case filling in, there is a consideration there that you will, possibly lose some flood risk reduction. That one is, again, a little bit like is it $100 million or $1 billion of cost there associated with that loss in flood control, because we don't have a currently assigned value for it now, because that flood pool is reallocated. I don't have a number to project, because we make this claim about the billions of dollars of flood damage reduction, that we have from the system. I forget what the report said from 2019. As bad as it was, You know, there was some benefit from having some of the water caught in the reservoir system. And then you might not have that at Park Lake. But that is a consideration that I don't have a great answer for. That one, again, would be kind of pure speculation. And without a current dollar to it, it's very hard to project it to a future dollar. So.
Sorry,
I have one more section. I'll ask you guys to be brief. We're running out of time. And I have more meeting to go.
Sure.
Just a transition.
Go ahead, Sandy.
Any further questions after?
Just one question. I'm sorry it's gone for a few moments, but when we were talking about recreation and just the variables that enter in, I mean, with Nebraska's plans of upgrades, is that going to maybe double recreation numbers? I don't know, but that's something that should be taken into account too, in thinking about the future and what that recreation value is.
Increase before it decreases.
Yeah.
And just so everybody understands what she's talking about, it's the Nebraska Star Wars project. We're putting in $90 million between here in Yankton and Niobrara State Park on their side of the river. And then in addition to that, earlier this week, there was a South Dakota tourism report that came out that shows that within South Dakota tourism regions, the number one tourism region no longer is the Black Hills, it's Southeast South Dakota. So certainly some of that is on the stretch, on the river, so.
They included some projections on increases in tourism visits, recreation.
No, I was just kind of, I mean, it's another variable. If you're adding so many boat slips or whatever, you're gonna have an increase.
We'll take a look. I kind of be surprised if maybe they didn't project some kind of change in the recreation.
Scott or Sandy, do you guys have access to any even conceptual details of what that plan looks like for the state of Nebraska?
The Star Wars one, yeah. You're accurate.
Here's the map that came out here just in the past few days. This shows Wygon. They're looks like they're stepping up the slips by about 350 to 400 slips.
Yeah, and that's actually a core study right now for them to go in. We have a comment period open, so. So that is out there, yeah.
We were talking about it on the drive up and I hadn't seen anything, but I also haven't looked for anything either, so.
Is ongoing.
I know they're taking core samples in Niobrara State Park for the new lodge. So.
Excuse me, folks. I know this is clumsy with me being remote but Paul, can you please direct you folks on this recreational benefit just to multiply by 10 and then multiply by 100 and do the numbers? Isn't that possible?
It is certainly possible, and I think we've already discussed it here. We'll take those numbers and do some thresholding and all of that and see whether it matters. I don't know whether it's going to be 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times, but we'll start with kind of the highest numbers that are part of our current, as Drew mentioned there, some of these specialized recreations. We'll check back the number of visits per year. And then, we'll put some escalation factors on there and see what those numbers come up to. They're one piece of 7 pieces or something like that. So I just don't want to overpromise that it's all of a sudden going to be this panacea and we're going to flip the numbers and then all of a sudden we can justify $1 million project on 2 times, right? That's, but Roland, we'll scale those up and see what they look like. And we can put those kind of in a conceptual framework for consideration in the report.
Couple that.
Thank you.
with realistic decommissioning.
Well, and we're that part of the removal number. I had talked with Jeff about that last month. And he's out. I haven't had a chance to follow up with him, but we'll make sure because that's a driver there. We talked about that, Sandy, a month or two ago. Put in some of these big numbers and kind of see where it flips. We don't know whether that's a real number or not, but at least we know kind of what that number would need to be to forward that discussion. Right. Okay.
I got one more real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
These discount models or methods that you pointed out, you've got a number of them, nine of them, whatever it is. There's quite a range in dollar figures. Huge range, and you mentioned something about the exponential one is the one you guys are gonna go with, or is it?
Well, not go with, that is our standard economic model policy for analysis for a project.
That's your standard.
That's the standard, but in this, that because we're in a section 22 and we're not encumbered, but we're not trying to justify a construction project in this study, so we don't have to use it, and that's why they're all up there.
Yeah.
That top number that Justin showed of 13-ish million, that largest number, that's with no discounting, right? That's like keeping the full value of everything into the future. And so that being said, you know, and if there's more recreation, there's additional costs, and you come into decommissioning, maybe that number is 25, 30, 40 million, I don't know. That being said, you know, the real part of it is that, you know, the Corps has never pushed through a construction project not using the standard exponential discounting to justify a project. So doing it on paper is one thing. If we think we have something, and then starting the discussion about justifying a large project with non-traditional economic analysis is the next step. And that's why we did this now versus later after we spent buku dollars on engineering analysis, right?
Obviously, those other methods aren't without merit. That is taken from research. Somebody's looking at that specifically for water resource projects. But like you said, it's just the flexibility we have on a traditional study, not this, but traditional one is pretty limited. It would be quite a heavy lift to convince someone of some of those other methods.
Yeah, now we've got the emphasis with this study.
Oh, absolutely.
Look at these different models and then see which one.
As part of WRDA 2020, we had revised language under 1179A, which the states here and many in this room had help in influencing, that specifically calls out for the Corps to evaluate life cycle economics and reservoir management. Looking at variable discount rates, capturing the other expenses, capturing a decommissioning and a removal cost, major rehabs as sunk costs, looking at ancillary impacts, downstream, upstream, moving Niobrara, none of which are captured in the standard model. All of those together give us this framework of life cycle economics to look at all the moving pieces. So that's why we're doing it here, because honestly, this authority under section 22 gives us the flexibility to do that. We can do whatever the sponsor wants us to do. It doesn't have to by the letter follow the process, which is why we're going here.
Yeah, some of the values are, I think, very high. You know, I mean, with the different models and therefore in itself could justify a costly project where your standard one would not maybe.
Right, absolutely.
So-
You could, I think our goal was to try and say, can we look at a different model where it would start the discussion is that with these life cycle economics, considering all these costs and all these losses of benefits, is there a model where we could at least be able to say with a straight face, we could honestly justify a project to develop a sustainability system on Lewis and Clark. Whether that happens is, you know, but we're trying to get to that point and know what the parameterization is of an analysis to say, we can do this for 20 million, and we can show you under this model that we're losing 30 million a year. And then you can have that discussion. That's what we're trying to get, right?
Yeah, good explanation, Paul, thank you, yeah.
We have 5 minutes, Sandy, if you want it on, just give people a flavor of all the other things going on, some other places we're asking for money to leverage here.
Especially for these three, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll cover this. Greg, pop in where.
Okay.
All right, Greg's
Tag team.
gonna be my bearer of bad news for anything I don't want to talk about here.
No, wait a minute.
Yeah, oh yeah, you didn't know that? I might have left that out of the email inviting you to this thing. Okay. quickly on phase 3 scoping, right? We're working on the draft report right now. Part of that has been my inability to be in this hemisphere in the last month or two. So it's 100% on me to get that to the folks here. I think though, we may have obligated our economics team for a few more taskers today to finish those up. So we'll be working on that over the next couple of weeks here. And the next step of this was phase 3. As I said at the beginning, we kind of flipped how we normally do things in economic or engineering analysis with alternatives. Then we do the econ on them, right? We did it the other way. It's like, let's do the econ. Let's find out if there's ways that we can say, you know, under this model, we think we have a real case for a management action. And then phase 3 would, based on what, you know, MSAC and this group of sponsors wants to look at, do more of an engineering analysis on like, what does a built out project look like? What does it cost per year? What does it accomplish? So that we have a real, you know, a better number to compare to that one of benefits lost there. So that is something we hope to get started here in the, you know, next month or two, probably with a webinar or two. That's going to go on. Which of those kind of methods or technologies I talked about earlier that goes forward is up for discussion. If there are things in there that are just wholly unappetizing to the sponsor group, like I said, it's section 22. It's extremely flexible. It's almost a la carte, right? If the sponsor team says we want to examine A and B, but not C and D, that's what we do. So that'll be part of that scoping process there. Sandy and the MSAC team, Sandy and Scott put together a proposal with, was it EPA? Just 2 weeks ago or so, looking for some grant money on a pilot study. And one of the things we put together is contact for a pilot on the bed load collector on the Niobrara River. We contacted our research lab. They have a 12-foot collector that can load up and bring up here, and we could, you know, if we get, and it's not huge funding. It's not, you know, we don't need millions to do this, but set it up on the Niobrara River, pump a big pile of sand, have a field day, show proof of concept, and then from that kind of extract and do some trend analysis. Like, all right, if you're going to use this method, and you're going to apply it, and you're going to put how many of these, where are you going to put it, how many, you know, thousands of cubic yards are you going to pull out with this, and then what kind of impact or benefit is it going to have for the reservoir? So that is ongoing there. You know, it's probably a little bit exploratory in the proposal process, or in the grant process. We'll also work it into the phase 3 scoping. We can put it in there, and then hope that the EPA comes through with it. If not, then the sponsor team can then consider whether they still want to fund it on a 50-50 cost share, or they want to keep it separate and continue to look for a grant opportunity for that. You know, advanced economic analysis. We talked a little bit about this earlier. Are there things, additional things we want to push here? Roland Hotchkiss alluded to some of the numbers. He and some former students have been working on an updated kind of economic model. They've built a spreadsheet model with help from folks at Reclamation. It's got some, as part of its equations, it has some values that, you know, have not been calculated through our process in phase 2. But one, because we didn't know we needed them, because this didn't exist a year ago. So the question could be, as part of that, do we want to do that when we get phase 3? You know, the questions that Paul and Jeff brought up, you know, do we want to follow up and do more thresholding, adjust those numbers, and look at the impacts they have even more than what we've got in phase 2. And then, you know, there's more opportunities. We've got this big kind of growth, and Greg is our environmental justice coordinator in the district. We have those now in all of our districts. So we think there may be some, you know, opportunities there. It's a very fledgling program. So not a lot of muscle behind it, but it has some support. And so there may be some opportunities for that scoping. So we've put that together kind of over the summer, scoping, and then see where that goes. And or the phase 3 is kind of to say, we have this economic justification. We did this analysis on a couple of different methods, and a recommended action for a management plan would be to do X, Y, and Z in this order with these expected benefits. And as somebody pointed out earlier, I think Mark, you did with your article. And we talked about this earlier 2 years ago when we set this up. So one of the very first processes that the Corps is moving through for a sediment management plan. So our goal is always to be to like break the process, fix the process, build the roadmap, and say, this is what we came out with Lewis and Clark. These are the pitfalls we found. Here's what worked. So there's a lot more value. You all don't directly realize that benefit, but everybody else all over the country who's dealing with the same issue should, because there should be a lot of lessons learned. There should be a framework for developing these sediment management plans that comes out of this effort. So related studies really quick. I talked about Lewis and Clark hydrographic surveys. We've got new surveys, we get new numbers on storage impacts, updating those RAS models. Many of you may have heard we're updating flow and stage frequency on the lower river. That's from Gavin's Point down all the way to St. Louis. I'm also in parallel to this serving as the project engineer for those. So we've got flow frequency. That's like the 1% flood, the 100-year flood flow level at all the gauges down below Gavin's. That'll be out next month. We started on stage frequency. That has big ramifications because when those stages get adjusted, new FEMA mapping comes out. Levees get still certified, decertified, all kinds of things going on with that. Okay. No direct impact if we're talking above Gavin's, but we are also with Silver Jackets with the state of South Dakota and North Dakota, I think. We've got a request in to update the flow frequencies in the reservoir reach. We have on the reservoirs, we call them discharge frequencies. So the 1% discharge frequency at Fort Randall is 100,000. That means, there's a 1% chance in any given season that we're going to discharge 100,000 CFS from Randall. We've got more decades of data, so we're looking to update that information. We have a Missouri River system plan going on the lower river, looking at flooding impacts there. Nebraska Highway 12 is still in the process and has been for quite a while, trying to lock down the wetland easement properties needed to get that moving forward. So it is creeping along right there. I don't have an exact time frame on when that'll happen, but it's still in process. And then Greg, I'll defer to you on the last one there, and anything else you want to say.
So the only couple things I would add, Paul, on the Silver Jackets proposal for Upper Missouri River Basin flow frequency, that is a proposed project. It has not been decided whether it's going to be funded yet. But the intent is to update the discharge probability of the gauges up here in Gavin's. And so we'll see kind of whether that gets funded. And then what the timeline for that would be. Pocket Creek 208, some of you might be familiar with that. It's a program that the Corps has for small, basically clearing and snagging, but you can do debris and sediment removal under it. The projects are limited to $500,000 total federal. The first 100,000 of that is the feasibility study. We've been working on this for a couple of years. We have recently kind of come to a dead end. Like we are not going to be able to recommend a plan. What has come to light in the analysis is that the environmental mitigation is bigger than the cost of the dredging. So now we have a cost that's over $1.5 million, and over half of it is environmental mitigation. And because we're limited to only about 400,000 that we can throw into the construction of that, Knox County Roads, who's the sponsor for that, would have to kick in the other million plus. And so we've talked to them about that. They don't really have the ability to do that. If they were gonna spend $1 million, they could probably figure something else out to do for $1 million potentially on their own. So that project is like, it is at a dead end. It is probably going to get terminated in the near future. There's not really a path forward for us to recommend a plan with the economic justification. It's not there. And it's so much bigger than what the program would allow us to do, that the burden of cost that falls on the non-federal sponsor really isn't fair. So we don't really have a project there, but I would let people know that is late breaking. We've shared that information with Kevin Barta within the last couple of weeks. He has shared that information with the county board of supervisors. And so they know what's going on. Whether or not that information has made it out to people is probably not happening yet, would be my guess.
It was in the Niobrara paper last week.
Was it? Okay. So that is unfortunate. We've been trying to uncover every possible avenue to figure that out, but it's not gonna happen.
Can you put in a nutshell, what was the environmental mitigation or what caused that to escalate or what?
The environmental mitigation issue stems from almost all of the land, including the channel itself, is under NRCS easement now. And NRCS's process for mitigating impacts to WRP lands is very prescriptive, and that's driving the cost.
Essentially access, right? To get in and rub out the Ponca Creek channel, we need to get into Ponca Creek, right? Which requires an access down the channel itself, which some of it is in the easement, and some sort of access road for trucks if we're gonna do it in dry land. So by the time you build a road, you pull all that material out and then you mitigate that access, that mitigation exceeds what it would cost us to get excavators and trucks down there to clear it.
On the Egypt environmental justice 40 front, I will share that, I think specific to flood risk management, there is going to be a Federal Register notice come out sometime in June. At least I got an email on this a couple days ago for a new program that the Corps is piloting, basically asking for communities that qualify under the criteria that's outlined, which is like low per capita income, high unemployment, tribal, there's a few other ones, but they can get a study and a project at 100% federal. This pilot program is going to propose 10 projects. So there's going to be a call for proposals come out in the Federal Register sometime next month. And communities that are interested can put their names in, and then that's going to get evaluated by, again, Corps headquarters.
Sounds like Niobrara and Santee.
That's correct. I mean, so there's that's coming out. I just mentioned it for people's situational awareness.
Anything on other general studies or?
Not really on the upper basin right now. We have been working with Jeff and company on potential fish passage. Study on the reservoirs, not fish passage, fish loss on reservoir operations, mostly Oahe. And then Montana has interest in Fort Peck. But other than that, we don't really have anything else really large in the upper basin right now. Other than dam safety issues, we're doing a dam safety lot study at Garrison, doing a risk assessment at Hawaii. We're building a spillway modification for dam safety issues at Pipestem up by Jamestown. So those are the big things in the upper basin are really kind of the dam safety realm right now.
I'll leave you very quickly with this last slide, and this is R&D stuff, but I kind of like subtitled this, "There's Still Hope." Okay, like episode 4, A New Hope. right? Well, a continuing hope. We have recently at Tuttle Creek in Kansas, between great support from the Kansas Water Office and the Corps of Engineers, built a water injection dredge and are going to pilot water injection dredging on Tuttle Creek next spring to move and flush sediments through one of their low-level environmental gates and out to the Kansas River. So these things do happen, right? And then we do have a request in through our coastal and hydraulics lab to kick off a $10 million reservoir sedimentation work unit with specifically identifying up to 6 million of that for pilot projects to actually put something on reservoirs and start moving sediment. And then in reference to those guardians of the reservoir winners, they've been looking for opportunities to get on US reservoirs and show their goods. And so we have a proposal with Bureau of Reclamation to try and get at least $500,000 for them to put one of these desediment units on a reservoir for a couple of weeks in Colorado late this fall. So apologize for cutting into lunch. Never my intent, but we always have wonderful discussion here. So Sandy, anything else from you?
I guess, as far as the feasibility, we've talked about that, trying to get that in the budget. What are your thoughts on that? Does that kind of change with this other opportunity or?
No, I don't. I wouldn't say so.
Negatively affect that at all.
From my perspective and all the things, I gotta walk a little bit of a fine line here. Your best bet to get, because the 1179A authority has yet to be funded. So it's gonna require
Anywhere.
anywhere.
Yeah, we have 0 starts.
So it's gonna have to be, it's gonna require a new start consideration, which they're difficult to get. So, I mean, from the core budgeting process, it will be very difficult for us to budget for it and have it compete and get selected. But when the appropriations bills are developed, the congressional offices and the appropriations committee shape what ends up being in the final bill. And so, keeping the congressional offices engaged and probably ensuring that both states are kind of lockstep in terms of, like, it's gonna be a big effort. A feasibility study to develop an actual implementable plan is base cost $3 million, 1.5 million federal, 1.5 million non-federal. The scope will be developed. It could be greater than that. It potentially could be less than that, but very rarely. And then the implementation, like the stuff we've looked at, is tens, if not 100 million in capital cost and anywhere from 2 to 10 million annually forever. That's a lot of money. And the federal government, I'm guessing, isn't going to pick it up at 100% federal cost. Everything we do is cost shared anymore, pretty much. So it's going to require, a coalition of partners to figure that out. And so I think it's great that we have broad participation. In fact, and the board have been great at bringing everybody to the table to talk about the issues and try to develop a plan. And I think we're making progress towards figuring that out. But the best avenue to get appropriations for that is going to be to work through the congressionals, in my opinion. We'll put our packages in, but I don't expect them to compete.
But still try for 1179A, or would there be a different route that would?
I still think 1179A, because it's specific to sediment management in upper Missouri reservoirs, is your best authority. Probably. Those, most everything else that's more general is going to be a little bit more, probably a little more challenging, I would say.
And you lose that ability to have a construction authority. And that's kind of the one thing you have with 1179A. We don't have the section 22 here, right? You come out with a plan there is no construction authority associated with section 22. We have to go over to some other authority anyway. Admittedly, as Greg was saying, 1179A for construction is 50-50 cost share. So if we've got $100 million project.
No, well, I don't know if we know what the construction cost share is.
Well, we have
Study cost share is.
Yes, study cost share is 50-50. Our guidance says that the construction cost share is yet to be determined, but at best, it's gonna be 65-35 federal, at best. So even a $100 million project, I still need to find a $35 million local sponsor.
There's some really vague language in 1179A about project beneficiaries and how. the
Yeah,
cost-
and that would, if we end up with 1179 a project, we get to do all the bloodletting on what that all looks like. But like we said, there hasn't been another one under that authority. So all of that has yet to be figured out. So I understand that that's not great news. I would have hoped by this time, after having that originally in Word of 2016, that somebody might have got one, but we just haven't yet.
And if you got, and if we got through the feasibility study and we had a plan for implementation, and you're trying to figure out that cost share partner, Western Area Power or somebody like that might be a partner.
It could really depend on the project, like
It would
if
kind of depend.
Yeah.
it's focused on like maintaining water intakes or something, that would probably be a whole different.
Yeah, that could be EPA or someone like that, or, like say, if it's hydropower focused, it could be someone like WAPA.
We got some space between now and then, so. We'll work on that. We'll develop, I'm sure, a little bit.
Yep.
Real quick, Paul, timeline on the scoping process, and does that include a public comment period?
Since it's under section 22, if the sponsor wants a public comment period, the sponsor can request and do that. We're not bound by any, under section 22, we don't have a public input required, but I think, when we were scoping this phase 2, I know Sandy at the time, there was some outreach and all of that. Absolutely, we wouldn't think why we wouldn't do that, right? But yeah, that's something we need to, I think we're gonna kind of kick that off and do that this summer. Part of it is kind of getting a little bit into that and kind of helping that initial discussion wordsmith our recommendations in phase 2, because you kind of want that to flow and say recommendations from this or to do this, and then you're right into that, right? So that you don't have a disconnect there. So I think those two things will have some overlap as we transition this summer. Absolutely.
The organization MSAC will have, we'll be able to shape how that goes.
Yep.
For you. But that could be, could come up in the next few weeks.
Yeah, we can put that formally in the scope if you wanted that, or MSAC can facilitate that independently. That's completely up to you.
The phase 2 final report draft or what's.
Couple weeks here. Yeah, we're working on that. We talked about that yesterday. We're trying to get some things for environmental review next week. And then staple it all together, all these separate pieces. So, was it early to mid-June, wasn't it, Jen, that we were trying to?
We were hoping, June 12th-ish to get
Ish,
you
yeah.
a review copy.
And then get you something, and then we need that back check on kind of these econ issues and what those recommendations are. Feed that back to us, and then I think that's the time when you've got the draft document knowledge. That's probably time to start having that phase 3 discuss. Absolutely.
Phase 3 scope.
Yeah, so that we can kind of line them up together as one wraps up. And yeah.
Okay. So I'll hold you to that.
All right.
Well.
It's all on me. I'm gonna go do some econ on the way home this afternoon.
You got like 2.5 hours.
Yeah, just gonna wave my hands, get some of that done. All right, thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Everything else with that, I think that's good. So we'll keep moving along before you guys. So, on behalf of us and with Mark, thank you very much for coming up on a large group to do this. I know in the past few years, it's been a lot of for various reasons, a lot of virtual stuff. So it's certainly for me, it's great to have you guys here and hear from you. in person.
We appreciate it. I am going to have to excuse myself. Today is my daughter's 13th birthday. And so I'm already in trouble. I don't want to be gone any longer than I have to be. So we'll bid our adieu and thank you all for your time. We'll be in touch.
Yeah.